Welcome to the Black Entrepreneur Experience podcast, inside the business, buzz, and brilliance of Black entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Dr. Frances Richards.
What happens in Vegas goes all over the world on Black Entrepreneur Experience, episode number 96. Thank you for joining us for Black Entrepreneur Experience. This is where we shine the light on the most successful Black entrepreneurs in the world. I'm your host, Dr. Frances Richards. Today I have with us Rodney C. Burris. He's an educator, national speaker, youth advocate, and entrepreneur. He's also an author of Get Off the Cycle and Run. Rodney, thanks for joining us. And you know what? I've given our audience just a snippet of your background. Why don't you fill in the gaps and share with us what you'd like us to know about you and your company?
My company is called Book RCB LLC, but the strength of my company is not in that name, right? That's very much behind the scenes. My brand is myself. I have been marketing me as a personality, as an author, as a speaker for a long time and achieved some fairly modest success with it. Very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I had very humble beginnings. We were homeless for a little while as a child. I lived in a city rescue mission, experienced domestic violence in my home. We actually transitioned between more than one state when I was a kid, trying to just adjust and get away from those conditions. And through it all, just being connected to our roots, our culture, and I think a lot of the strength that I believe that Black folk inherently have that gets passed down generation to generation, I have been able to come out of that and help other people come out of that. So the opportunity to talk about this with you, Dr. Richards, is just a phenomenal blessing. I'm very grateful to be here.
Take us on that journey. How do you go from such a painful beginning to propel you into your purpose, to ultimately lead you into your destiny?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm the oldest child of three, and my two younger siblings are both girls. I was the oldest and only boy of the family. My dad is a great guy. He's a really good friend of mine at this stage. But in our beginning, when I was a child, we didn't have that connection. He had some challenges of his own and some different things that he was dealing with. And those challenges played out really, really tough between him and my mom. Long story short, there was substance abuse in my home, and the violence happened between my parents. One day, in a particularly elevated fit, one of those episodes, my mom decided that she would burn up our entire home. She was going to, my dad, they had a really bad argument. There was some physicality that occurred between the two of them. He went and laid down on the couch and fell asleep, as my mom retells it. I was only about 7 or so at the time, and I was upstairs and completely oblivious to this. And she thought that she was going to get the gas can, the little red lawnmower.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So she was going to take that, Dr. Richards, and douse him, the living room and everything else, and kind of like burn her problems away, let them kind of all go to ashes. And in a moment of clarity, right as she was kind of gathering everything to execute that, she just had a moment where she figured, I would just leave instead. The next morning, she threw me and my sisters in a car, and she drove until she felt safe. I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. I spent the first several years of my childhood in Maryland, right here in Baltimore. And when she put us in a car and drove until she felt safe, she took us down Highway 95. And if anybody listeners out there, Dr. Richards, if they know the East Coast, Eastern Seaboard, 95 stretches from Maine to Miami. She jumped on 95 and she drove until she hit Florida. There was literally nowhere else to go. And that's how we got to Florida. We got down there and we stayed in the car for a little while. And by stayed, I mean lived, slept. We had one of those styrofoam coolers that you kind of fill with ice and bologna and cheese and things of that nature. So that was our refrigerator. And we did that for a few days. Next thing I know, we found ourselves in a city rescue mission. And every time I share this part of my story, Dr. Richards, I vividly taste the powdered milk. As a little boy, that part of it is like seared into my being. There were these red plastic cups that they had, and they would mix us milk, but it was a very watery, thin drink. And I learned later that it was actually the powdered substance. I never before had powdered milk before then. It was not a pleasant experience for me. I shared this with a group of older ladies one day. I was sharing my story, actually kind of connected to the city rescue mission down there in Florida. And one of them corrected me, Dr. Fred. She was like, powdered milk is good. You got to know how to fix it. You got to know what to put in. I've learned to not badmouth powdered milk, but for me as a child, I did not enjoy it at that moment. And it is a very real recollection for me when I share this part of my story. And we moved a lot. We went from the city rescue mission to this really ratty, beat down home on the east side of Jacksonville. It was a part of Jacksonville called Springfield. We stayed there for a few weeks, maybe a couple months. I don't recall the timeline as a child, but we were there for a short period. And we went from there to these projects. And I remember, Dr. Francis, there was iron gates. It was like wrought iron, the black gate that they use around buildings like that. And I never forget, even though at that time I was maybe about 8, maybe going on 9 years old. And I remember being aware that it didn't feel like they were keeping danger out. It felt like we were being kept in. That was such a surreal thought to have, I think, as a little kid. And I was aware that wasn't a normal kiddie thought. Like, all of that was happening at the same time. Like, this is a normal thing, like, bro. But I couldn't shake the fact that anytime they would close it up, there was very few entrances and exits, like, to even to be able to walk. Like, there was a couple of, like, walk portions where it would open like a door, so to speak. But it literally felt like get everybody in at night and keep them in there like a pen, as opposed to this is a gated community kind of thing. It always felt like that. So we moved. I never had stable roots. I never grew up with friends. The most stable thing in our life at the time is something that I think many Black folk can connect to, is our place of worship. Our place of worship was the one consistent thing in my life during that period. So from the time I was about 7 or 8 down there in Florida to the time I was about 18, I think I went to maybe 7 or 8 different schools. We moved probably 6 or 7 times. There was just no stability. And I didn't realize until I was graduating high school, I was on my way to Johns Hopkins University. I always had fairly decent grades. Well, I had pretty good grades. I scored really well on standardized testing. I had a lot of behavioral problems. I was acting out, but I always was academically very strong. And it landed me an opportunity to vie and secure a position at Hopkins. I was on my way to Hopkins, and I was having a talk with my guidance counselor, and she was like, "Do you realize what your mother did for you?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She was like, "Rodney, the story you just told me, she was moving you guys through socioeconomic neighborhoods. Like, she was moving you up and all the way to an opportunity." The high school that I graduated from, the kids, there were families that lived in a country club. Their parents were corporate execs and C-suite officials of this company and that company. And those are the people that I spent my last 2 years of school with. They were all thinking about bigger and better and connecting and building an opportunity all across the spectrum. Definitely, it was very diverse as far as race and ethnicity. But I got to be around people that were thinking in that light. And it gave me a love for women who look like you, Dr. Richards. My mom and others like you all who have opened the doors, stayed up late, wiped the noses, driven the long hours on the road, just done all of the things that children, teenagers, grown adult children may not fully even be aware of, all of the bridges that are covered. It makes me think about Tupac, one of his lyrics in his song about his mom in Dear Mama. He says, "There's no way I can pay you back, but my plan is to show you that I understand." And that's been my foundation.
Wow, that is such an amazing story, Rodney. Thank you for being so transparent and just sharing that journey. What did you major in Johns Hopkins?
I was a psychology major. I thought I wanted to be a brain surgeon. There was this doctor at Hopkins in the 80s and 90s. You may have heard of him, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Ben Carson.
And I heard about him a little bit.
You're a little familiar with that name. So Ben Carson wrote a book called Gifted Hands.
Yes.
Somebody gave me that book when I was in high school. I read the book and I identified with the book. And actually that book gave me inspiration to become a doctor because I didn't know what I wanted to do with a career. I knew I had good grades. I figured smart people became businessmen. I didn't know what to do, right? I read that book and I'm like, wow, this guy grew up in the hood. His mom was serious about education. This sounds a lot like me. I want to do what he does. My whole plan was to make it to Hopkins so that I could become a pediatric neurosurgeon like Dr. Ben Carson. Well, I got to Hopkins and I got to see an aneurysm surgery. For those, there's some folks who know exactly what I'm talking about, but there's a couple who I may need a quick reminder or refresher. An aneurysm happens when a blood vessel bursts inside of your brain. To give you a visual, if it's helpful, think about like a long skinny balloon that you twist, right? And the part that has a lot of pressure gets really thin. It turns into like a bowls out. And at that point, it's under a lot of stress. And if it bursts, it causes a situation in your brain where, you have a lot of negative effects. So this lady, she underwent this surgery. They took care of her, but I was writhing looking at this, right? And I wasn't even in the actual surgical room, but, we was looking at it through a camera feed. So that was the first thing. And then the second one I saw was also a video, and it was a cesarean section. Dr. Francis, let me tell you something. Divine opened up the sky for me. The birds sang, I heard the harps playing, and I understood in my soul that being a doctor and cutting people up and dealing with all that blood and organs and guts was not for little Rodney C. Burris. So I switched from neuroscience and working with the brain to psychology and working with the mind. I was like, I'll help people with their thoughts and not with their actual brain tissue. And I graduated from Hopkins and I started getting into the educational field. I did not begin practicing psychotherapy immediately like I thought I was going to. I got into the educational advocacy field, and it started me on this journey of traveling and talking and networking and building. And I realized the power from another entrepreneur, one Sean P. Diddy Combs, who has consistently set the example of whether it has been his clothing line or his music line or his beverage line or anything that he's been involved in. The real reason why we buy into it is because of the personality that's connected to it. We as a community, as a society, as a global community, we buy into who Sean Puff Daddy P. Diddy Combs, who he is. And that was that had a major impact on me coming out of college. And once I began to see that happening in my own life and how people were responding, that got me started, and it got me here to be able to talk with you today.
I need you to connect another dot. So you majored in psychology.
Yes.
And you're into pretty much branding yourself.
Yes.
Talk to us about your ideal client and give us an inside look of a day of operating your business.
Gotcha. Okay. I graduated with a psychology degree, like we said. I went on to get a master's in management, but I didn't use those tools in the way they were designed, right? Have you ever been, you know what it's like. You probably, I'm not sure you're past this point, but you remember it was nothing to go to somebody's house in the 80s or 90s. And antenna for the TV set was a hanger that somebody pulled out the closet. The channels are coming in, but it was a wire hanger that was actually being used as an antenna. That was my experience with my degrees. And I say that to say, although I had a psychology degree and a management degree, I didn't use those to go into an organization and be middle management as a psychotherapist. I actually found my strength in helping others grow and telling my story. So I've been invited to juvenile detention centers early on in my career, early in my 20s. I would go to orphanages. I was in foster homes and dealing with group homes. And there became a lot of power in my story. I saw people kind of getting a certain life, a certain vibrant experience from me sharing my story. And that began to open doors for me to go to bigger nonprofits, different organizations, universities, colleges, schools, high schools around the country. Being able to have those letters behind my name and throw those degrees around and graduate from an institution like Hopkins has been phenomenal for me, yes. But what I found is that me living my day-to-day, that began to open doors for me in ways that was different than my educational background, if that makes sense. And so by the time I got to starting my own company, it's my initials, RCB Booking. My name is Rodney Christopher Burris. It's just my initials. But the power is in bringing people together, bringing nonprofits, bringing human service agencies, educational institutions together, using the power of the story, of the spoken word as the fuel, but then providing real tools, real access for growth, for organizational development, for professional development, for team building, for strategic planning, for mission and visioning, scope and strategy sessions. And so my strength as a consultant and as a motivational speaker has been what has really pushed me through as a professional.
Rodney, did you go the traditional route working for someone else, or did you launch your business? It sounds like you just took off and launched your business.
Right in it. I had a year and a half of being fully employed. I was working with an organization that dealt with Black men. It was a fatherhood-focused organization, and I loved it because I didn't grow up with my dad. When I found this opportunity, I was brought in, and they were like, we're trying to do this new initiative, and your job, Rodney. So Hopkins, for those who may not know, Hopkins is in Baltimore. I literally came back to Baltimore to go to college, and I started my family here. I met my wife while we were in school and all of those great things. So I was in this fatherhood agency, and we were about to have our first kids. Anthony and Leah were coming along. I told the guys, like, I need some more money. This is a nonprofit, and I just want to I need some sort of supplemental income. And we jumped online and we saw some organizations that were vying to have people come in and work with young people. They was like, can you tell a story? Do you think you can help people grow and develop? If so, send us a video. We would love to have you come in with us and maybe share you with a few other people that we know in and around this region. And I'll never forget this. I'll never forget how excited he was. He took me around the entire office. He said, Rodney's life is about to change. He was like, this opportunity is tailor-made for him. He's about to go. Like, he's about to blast. We're not going to get to see too much more of him. And that was on a Friday, and I needed to submit my video and everything would be fine. I had some long hair back then. I kind of had like cornrows or something like that. And I remember feeling unworthy, Dr. Richard. I remember feeling scared about the opportunity. I remember feeling like it was for everybody, but it wasn't for me, because the other part that I hadn't mentioned yet was, although my mother was very successful in moving us up the tier socioeconomically speaking, we were always at the bottom rung of that tier, right? So when I went to school with people that were in a country club, me and my sisters were barely eating dinner. We could eat breakfast at school. We could eat lunch at school. Dinner was a maybe if my mom could go to the store within that 2-3 week period. So I always had come from, up to that point, a place of lack. And I had resigned myself to the idea that it's just not for me. I had become very nonchalant about opportunities that seemed amazing that would fall through. It was my coping mechanism of being like, that's no big, because it wasn't for me anyway. Well, when he's walking me around and he's introducing me to all of these people, inside of myself, all I felt was, this ain't really gonna happen. I know, but they wouldn't even choose me if I sent it in. I got too much hair. They're not gonna like my image on the screen. And I don't really know what I'm talking about. Like, it was just all of this fetus mentality. It was really bad. It was very heavy, but it was my familiar friend at that point in my life. I was very comfortable with that feeling. That was on a Friday. Monday morning, I walked back in and he greeted me at the door. He's like, Rodney, tell me the good news. How'd it go? Like, I didn't send anything in. I didn't put it in. I didn't put it in the mail. He was like, what? What do you mean? Man, I didn't have a video call. So this is like 2003 or 4 or 5, something like that. So cell phones didn't have cameras, as you know, back then, right? So it wasn't that situation. You actually had to use the little mini camcorder things. And I didn't have a way to record it. And like, what are you talking about? We got one at the office. I got one at my home. What do you? Well, man, I didn't get a haircut, man. Nobody did my hair, man. And this guy, this older Black brother, and I mean this with every bit of positivity I can possibly muster right now, cussed me out in that office building. And he said, Rodney, don't you ever let somebody be more excited about your future than you are for yourself. And he made me walk back around to those same managers, same executives, and said, Rodney didn't believe in himself enough to take this first step. He didn't make this happen. Wow. He could have done it. But you want to know something? Sometimes I've told that story and it sounds really harsh. Like, I listen to it like, man, that's really messed up. But for me at that time, it was the catalyst that I needed. It was a swift kick in the rear for me.
That's great.
I mean? It was what I needed. That week, I cut all of my hair off. And maybe I didn't need to, but it helped my mental shift, if that makes any sense to anybody. it helped me mentally shift. Some people go and become natural. Some people, wear extensions, whatever we may need to tap into our confident and our authentic self. I respect it, because you could take somebody else and they do those same things and it doesn't work because it's inauthentic. For me, cutting my hair was a way of me letting go of the mindsets that was crippling me at that time. And I needed to do it. And so I submitted my tape. They was like, wow, yeah, come in. And the rest is history. That was 2005. And I haven't worked full time for any organization outside of myself since 2005. It's 2018. Like I said, my wife and I have 3 children. It hasn't always been, please, it has definitely been challenging. The paydays that come with being an entrepreneur, being self-employed, can be very seasonal. You can have huge days, as you know. You have days where it's like, oh, this is great. The money's great. People are calling. Clients are coming. And then you have long stretches of drought. And those things test you and they build you. And I'm pretty sure I have more of those to come. I'm not saying that I have arrived and I have achieved. But what I am saying is that the mentality shift that it takes. I listen to individuals like Will Smith. I listen to Oprah. I listen to Tyler Perry. I listen to P. Diddy. I listen to different academics, your Cornel Wests, your different ones, your Tavis Smileys. I listen to these individuals and their story and how they approached it. And so whether they're in hip hop or they're in business or they're engineering or they're in the spiritual sector, there are certain underlying truths about intention, about being courageous enough to push through when it doesn't look good. And that's what we need. That is my hope to share with fellow entrepreneurs that are listening to us right now. Like when it gets tough, and you've probably already experienced some tough times already, that it will get better. But it will never change if we pull out, if we give up, if we change course. And so kind of just staying on that course and pushing through those tough times has been my biggest life lesson. And that is what I count as my greatest success.
Rodney, what is the one valuable lesson you wish you knew before starting your business?
Quitting, selling myself short. There was a gentleman who went to college with us. He was older than us. His name was Will. I don't know if he wants me to share his whole name, so I'm not going to share his whole name. But Will was older than us. He had a very tough life himself. It was a brilliant mind. And he came into college and went to Hopkins, and he was in his mid-30s when we were 18. We sat around one day, about 12 guys, and we envisioned this whole big major project that we were going to do, and we were going to propel ourselves into greatness. And I let it falter. I was one of the guys that believed in it in the moment and didn't do anything to help it past that little rah-rah session that we had. But a lot of people were kind of dependent on like, yeah, well, Rodney, what do you think? What do you think? And I kind of let it, other people as well, but I did my part in letting it just kind of fizzle out. And he said to me, he was like, why are you okay with mediocrity? Man, Dr. Francis, up until that point, I never had that mirror reflected back to me before. He was like, bro, why are you okay with mediocrity? And I tried to justify it. I tried to be like, no, man, because. And he kind of just shook his head. And he was like, it was enough for you to sit around and get the feel goods from talking about it. Now, I wish that I could tell you that I learned that lesson at that moment and it set my course the right way. I heard that lesson, but I didn't digest it at that time, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. By the time I meet my other guy, James Worthy, who gave me the kick in the butt that I was telling you about earlier, it was the same lesson. It was being okay with could have been. It was mediocrity. And I wish that I would have had that mindset of this will happen. That's one thing. Will Smith, man, he said this, and I recorded it in my little playlist. He tells this story, Dr. Francis, of being on a treadmill. He says, I may not be the most handsome actor. I may not be the most talented actor. He was like, I may not be the best. But he listed 4 or 5 different things. He was like, but there's 2 things I know. He says, if you put me and you on a treadmill next to each other, you're going to get off first or I'm going to die. He was talking to Tavis Smiley. He was like, it's that simple. He was looking Tavis in his face, and Tavis was trying to kind of laugh it off. And he was like, it's that 2 things are going to happen. He was like, either you're going to get off first or I'm going to die. He was like, that mentality is what propels me in my life, that I will not be outworked. I will not settle for mediocrity. That's when I learned that lesson. So I was well into my business at that point. I was well into promoting myself halfway, being okay with mediocrity, my wins and losses. 3 or 4 years ago, that experience, Will Smith told me that he would be okay with dying on the treadmill, and it opened up my mental in a way that hadn't been done before.
I was listening to your story, and it was so amazing, because when I think we need so many more James Worthys in our lives. And when I'm hearing your story, and I'm just like, wow, he was your boss or in your company and pushing you, wanting you to elevate.
Yes.
Which is very rare. And what I was going to say is that I believe we as parents and grandparents and aunts, and we want the best for our children. And a lot of times it's so important, the relationships that we get involved with, because one of the things you talked about was, it was like self-sabotage, the lack of believing in yourself and not really understanding why you felt the way you felt. And I think about a young man that I know and hadn't seen this young man. He's like 31, 32 years old and hadn't seen in about 10 years. And when I saw him, I mean, within 10 or 15 minutes of the conversation, it just went like really bizarre, like just off the chain, very hostile, right? And I couldn't believe it. And I said to him, I go, you are really an angry Black man. And I know his parents. And my heart just bled, because I think about young babies and young kids. And as parents, we have a responsibility to really give them the tools and responsibilities to grow up to be not menace to society, but very healthy or warm, loving children. And we just don't know what we do to our kids. Decisions that we make, how they really impact our lives.
You were mentioning something about, you said there were a couple of value bombs, and you were talking about growing up with my mom. And I think that's what you were about, that self-sabotaging.
Right.
I want to get to the place where my memories of those moments, because I can rattle off 3 or 4, right? Readily, right now, 3 or 4 moments where I absolutely was the cause of not even just halting my own forward progression, but literally regressing myself, literally not taking opportunity. I had a contract. Somebody saw me speaking, and they said, Rodney, you could teach anything to anybody if you believed in it. I believe that you would be great. And I was brought on this special team. We flew to Boise, Idaho, and we headquarters of Hewlett Packard. We were wined and dined by whoever these middle management, I don't know who these people were anymore, but we were wined and dined by these folks. And the whole premise was, this was like 05-ish or so, very early in my career. We were going to travel to different general post office, like the main hubs around the country, and teach them. They were all buying loads and loads of Hewlett Packard equipment. And we were this particular like scanner, printer, faxer, copier, deluxe pro. Now that's a common thing, right? You can get that in a desktop model these days. But 05, it was a huge industrial commercial machine that we were going to train on. And the contract was phenomenal, Dr. Richards. It was such a phenomenal and the opportunity to travel around. And I love engaging people the way I do. And I still would be giving my own brand, my own flavor to the meal. Yes, they want me to cook this Hewlett Packard training, but I get to season it with who I am. And I loved everything about it. And when I came back, we had a company conference call. I hadn't been to the gym. I was neglecting my health. I was tired of neglecting my health, and I only had this one small window to go. So I decided during the conference call to kind of get off the call and go to the gym. Now, at the time, I was like, I'm making a decision for myself. This is for my health and well-being. But I knew that this was the wrong way to do it. I kind of felt that internally, but I so wanted it anyway. I picked up the phone after a little bit. I kept checking in. I picked up the phone one time. The line was completely dead, completely silent. I reached back out to them the next day, a couple days later. They were like, yeah, that was a very important call. you were a no call, no show. Like, we didn't know what happened to you. We are going to accept your message that you are not as interested in this opportunity.
Wow.
You know, I lost a national contract with Hewlett Packard in the United States Postal Service in my mid-20s. It's things like that. It's the self-sabotaging, because can I tell you what was in the root of all of that? Disbelief that I was even worthy having something like it. All kind of comes full circle. Like, I couldn't believe that I was in their headquarters, overlooking a mountain view when we come out of Hewlett Packard. It was unbelievable, and it felt like it wasn't mine anyway, like a dream. So losing it or not honoring it was okay. I was able to let myself do that. Self-sabotaging. And I believe it's Black folk. But I had a friend of mine. He called me yesterday when I was driving back up from Florida visiting my mom. And he shared a lot of his heart, but something he said that was tough for me to hear. He said, Rodney, we get it so hard as Black folk, man. He said, sometimes I just wish I was white.
Wow.
He wasn't in a place for me to harp on that. He was saying he was rending his heart. He was sharing a lot of intimate stuff with me, and he's in a very tough decision point in his life right now. And so I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to really harp on that at that time. And I'll loop back around to it with him, but there's probably so many of us that have felt like that don't see the value and the beauty and the strength in our existence as we are, in who we are, with our history, with the bumps, with the bruises. There's so much value. There's so much potential. There's so much networking right here in our communities across the diaspora. If we can just with intention look across the diaspora and internally, like within the networks, within the families, within the communities, and pull out those Black diamonds, those nuggets, those pearls of wisdoms, those linkages that can connect us in ways that makes us probably one of the biggest and most powerful groups on this planet, if not the most. There's a way that can happen, but it takes a simple refocusing on what you magnify. Like, what are you looking at? Are you looking at the challenge more? Like, not to say that challenges aren't real, not to say that difficulties aren't real. I come from a background where statistically on paper, I should be dead or in prison. Me, I'm a African-American male, by some people, dark-skinned African-American male. That matters in some circles. You know, single-parent home, divorce, domestic violence, substance abuse. I shouldn't be a homeowner. My wife and I shouldn't have 5 children of our own. We don't have baby mamas and baby daddies. That's not my reality. It could be. It should be statistically. I don't want to take away the strength in somebody's experience or their struggle. But what I am saying is organizations, podcasts, and forums like the B Network that you have set up are phenomenal nexus points for our community that will help us increasingly get better at not wishing that we were other, but valuing who we are because of who we are.
And Rodney, you have said, wow, you have really, really touched on so many things. And when this podcast air, by the time they would have memorialized Aretha Franklin. So we want to honor her family and send out our sincere sympathy in their loss. The reason I bring that up is because that's exactly what they were talking about back in the day. Everyone that came forth, Smokey and all of them, just talked about the unity. And the young man, your friend, I can definitely feel his pulse. Yeah. And we do have to stay strong because the system and what's happening in our environment right now. And we have to think about the Martin Luther Kings and what they went through. I mean, when you shift, things are bad, right? When I say they're bad, I don't want to do a negative spin, but what I'm saying, things are really challenging now for African Americans. Okay. And so we've made some leverage. We've made some leadway. And so they're like, we're not sicking dogs on you, but you're doing other things to us. The system is set up for us to feel that way. And it's really sad that we cannot feel like that we can do so much more, but we are very, very powerful. We do have to keep our focus, and we have to keep our eyes to the prize, and we cannot relent. And like you said, whatever you focus on, that's where you go.
Yeah. Yes.
And we cannot focus on the negativity and everything else that's happening around us. We have to continue to have our own goals and objectives and stay true to who we are. And one of the things that I just want to commend you, Rodney, with your family, and you had shared about your wife, and that you did not say, I'm only going to have 1 or 2 children because of what happened. And you guys are just like doing such an amazing job, you and your wife. And like you said, you could have been a statistic, and thank God you were not.
Thank you.
And you were like, I'm going to defy all odds. One of the lessons you're saying to us is that you had to push past that.
Yes.
And you had to recognize that I was self-sabotaging myself and that I didn't feel worthy.
Yes.
And it is a mindset. And just like, one of the things that we talk about young people, like, and I've said this a lot of different times about if you take 2 people that have a baby, a Caucasian woman and a Black woman at the same time. And the words, they talk about how many more words a Caucasian baby will know more than an African American baby. Why is that so?
Because of being communicated to as early as possible, hearing sentences and being exposed to communication. I think that's the key. Was that it, or was it something different than that?
Yeah, and it's all about exposure. And like one of the things that I'm just learning from amazing Black entrepreneurs is that this one gentleman, he told us he's a real estate entrepreneur. And he's not a licensed realtor. He's made his money in real estate, and he was sharing that. And he said that when he and his twin brother, they met these Caucasian guys, and he thought that they were the same age. He and his brother were 25. These kids were like 18 years old, and they said that they had been in real estate since like 16 years old.
Exposure.
It's exposure.
That exposure in Baltimore, there was this epidemic when I moved back here. People who grew up on the west side of town, and in Baltimore, let me give you a little lingo here. We don't say the west side or the east side or north side. You say over east or you say over west, right? So if you ever come here and you're like, so are we on the west side? Everybody's going to be like, oh, she's not from around here, right? So you say over west or you say over east. But there are people who've grown up over east or grown up over west that have not left from over east and over west. And if they haven't left Baltimore City. There's some pluses and minuses in that, right? Baltimore is 70% Black. I think it's like 69 point something, right? 70% African American. People can live their entire life being exposed to the way Hollywood, the media, the music industry portrays. And you would think, based on when you go to school, your neighborhoods, because there's tons of middle-class families here, definitely tons of middle-class communities, that the United States of America looks like Baltimore. And the fact of the matter is, in the state of Maryland, right outside of the city limits, the state of Maryland doesn't look like Baltimore demographically speaking, let alone Iowa and North and South Dakota and Wyoming and all of the other states around. And so the things that I try to challenge people when I speak to these groups, and depend on the groups that I'm talking to, but when I'm talking to our young folk and I get permission from those principals or those directors of the group homes or wherever we are, when I get that little nod, like, go talk to him, Rodney, like, go ahead. I try to replicate the spirit, the push that James Worthy gave me. So I can never be James Worthy. I can't press rewind and play on what he did and said to me. It doesn't fit. But what I can give is the ethos of that, which is I need to give you some real talk. I need y'all to feel where we coming from, because right here, right now in our city, you're confined by your exposure, and it's not your fault. But at a certain point, it is up to you to change it or do something about it.
Right. Take responsibility.
Take responsibility is what it's all about.
Now, whatever happened to James Worthy, and is he aware of how much you appreciate him?
James Worthy is one of my big brothers to this day. I've authored a book about getting out of habits that make you stuck. It's called Get Off the Cycle and Run. It's been really well received around the country. I've been flying to New Mexico and different places down south, doing staff development and professional development around it. And I came to him. I wrote in his book. I wrote him like a little heartfelt note or letter or whatever, and I gave him a copy. And this big old grown man, he got 3 sons, all bigger than me. He's about 10 years older than me. James sat in his front seat of his car and he cried.
Wow.
You know, He cried, man. It was a beautifully overwhelming experience. I've had many mentors and givers in my life. I am here today because of the James Worthies, of the Darnell Smith, of the Daryl McCoys, of the Dexter Binders, different men in my life, all African American, all positive. And I've had some people from other ethnicities as well. Definitely, I've been very fortunate. I sought them out. If I can say that to our fellow entrepreneurs, Dr. Richards, seek out people that are talking how you want to be, even if that language isn't your current, is not how you speak about yourself, or it isn't how you speak about your opportunities. Surround yourself with books, with authors, with podcasts, with people that you can touch, with uncles and mentors and grandmas and cousins that are speaking the way you desire yourself to be. Because as you feed that into you, sooner or later, it's like filtering out water. In the beginning, that might all be salt water. But as you start cycling in that fresh water, you intentionally reduce the amount of salt and other deposits that are getting in there. If routinely just trying to put in fresh water, you're going to look up and you yourself are going to be a receptacle of that fresh water. You're going to be full of that fresh thinking and that mindset. So I seek out people like you, Dr. Francis. I almost called you Dr. B. You look like a honeybee. You look like a mama bee. I seek out individuals like yourself and the platforms that you provide. For those of you that haven't looked at her website in a while or ever, I had the pleasure to look at it not too long ago. And she talks about learning this dance that she wants to learn in Argentina. That sort of thinking, that sort of possibility. Those things, guys, will help us connect. And in the words of Debbie Allen on Different World, relax, relate, and release in ways that is greater than our circumstances. It's greater than our conditions. I'm all about it.
And Rodney, you mentioned about reading and books. What book would you recommend and why?
I read a book called Outliers. I want to recommend my own book and do a shameless plug. Rodney C. Burris, folks, Google it, Amazon. It's out there. It's phenomenal. But something that has spoken to me, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers. And he talked about all of the factors that went into people's success and the intentionality behind it. So I'm going to give an example. It seems as though many people, from the Williams sisters, Serena and Venus, the Beatles, not Bill Gates, what's the other guy? Steve Jobs. Different people, they have experienced something called the 10,000 hour rule. Do you know what that is?
Yes, I have, and I want you to share with our audience.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I love that, guys. The 10,000 hour rule struck me when I heard it. And basically it's this. It is a person achieves a mastery at anything that they spend 10,000 hours of their lifetime doing with intention, right? The Beatles had this really awkward period. This story sticks out for me, where they had like some opportunity to play at a bar, I think, in Germany, right? So they're from England. They have to travel to this other country, and they stayed in these little dirty, like rundown hostels, whatever. But they had to play maybe 2 shows, 3 shows a day, or 2, 3 shows on a weekend, or something really extensive throughout the week. For like this 3, 4, 5 year, 7-year period, was some very long period before they ever burst onto the scene in America. What they got to do was practice their synergy, their songwriting, their musicality, etc. The Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson had the very same thing. Tupac Shakur has hours and hours and hours of yet to be released music because that's all he did, right? And so you just think about all of these people. Steve Jobs spent hours and hours going to this college. It was back when colleges had like room-sized computers. He knew somebody that worked there. He had some sort of access, and he spent hours from like middle school through high school every day just in there. Now, here's the negative thing. Here's the flip. Everything has the heads and the tails, right? The tails of that is if you spend 10,000 hours goofing off, doubting yourself, not trying, being negative, being angry at things that have already happened as opposed to intentionally trying to move past that, you become a master at that. You become a master at sloughing off. You become a master at holding bitterness and the miry, stuck consequences that come with that. Doing it with intention. What am I working on? What about my craft as an entrepreneur, as a family person, as a loving sister, brother, individual? What am I working on with intention that I can get a mastery in? And when I read that, Dr. Francis, I really kind of spurred me to accept I desire to be one of the best communicators ever. I desire to help people release from where they are and grow to where they become. It is in my heart to do, it's in my essence to do. If I only will really be honed that by spending hours with that, I want to do it with 4 and 5 year olds. I want to do it with corporate execs. I want to do it with the schools that are around Baltimore. I want to do it with the universities that are in our nation. I'll do it for a little bit of money. I'll do it for I got 5 kids. I will take every bit of mortgage payment that these folks want to pay. But what I've also realized is sometimes the payment doesn't come in the form of dollars. Sometimes the payment comes in the form of so many other access to networks and opportunities. It is how other groups grow. It is how they expand. It's how they secure wealth. It's not always by exchanging dollar for dollar, quid pro quo, but sometimes it's exchanging access to opportunities, like Dr. Francis just talked about, that creates the network for us all to come up. So I desire to do that, and I go to many places as I can sharing, because I want to become a master at what we're talking about right now.
Rodney, if you conducted this interview, what is the one question that you would have asked yourself? And I want you to answer that question.
Woo! I would ask myself, why? Why'd you do it? Why this, right? Because there's so many ways to be successful. And there's so many different types of success. Why do you feel, Rodney, that you want to do it this way? And the way that I would answer that is, I was teaching a college class. And I don't want to make this sound all metaphysical and weird, but I felt like I had like an outer body experience. I wasn't like floating above the room or nothing crazy like that, but it was like I was observing me engaging with these college students. And I looked at me, Dr. Francis, and I saw myself and I was like, I feel like my most authentic self when I'm in front of a room. Whether that's a stage, whether they're old or young, whether they're incarcerated, because I've done that work before, any level of, when I'm in front of that room and I'm sharing content from my heart, it is my most authentic experience of who I am. I haven't experienced that any other sector. I've done different types of work. I've dibbled and dabbled trying to make ends meet over my lifetime. And it's not about the work. It gives me life. It's not work for me. It's like tapping into outlet. It gives me life. I would do it for free. If my bills were completely paid for, I would never ask for $1 from anywhere. I would never accept $1. I do appreciate anything, but it gives me life. And so I encourage you all, not you, Dr. Francis. I think you know where your dot is in life. I think you're in your flow. But for those of us that haven't quite found it yet, what is it that gives you a vitality when you experience it? What do you think about in your downtime? What's a sense of urgency that is like, man, when you're not doing it, you feel a little uncomfortable? Because that's your purpose. That's where you're supposed to be. And if you can get better at honing into that and giving it to us from your heart, we all will be better in the process.
Rodney, we come to the part of our podcast where we have the Fun Facts Lightning Round, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to answer very quickly. And if there's something that you choose not to answer, feel free to say pass. Are you ready for the Fun Facts Lightning Round?
I feel like we were Steve Harvey on Family Feud. Okay, I'm ready.
We don't even want to talk about that. Love Steve Harvey. The last movie you saw?
Black Panther. I just saw it again with my mom. She hadn't seen it yet.
You relaxed doing what?
Returning a rental car with my daughter.
Your favorite singer or rapper?
Mint Condition is my favorite band. Rick Ross is my favorite rapper.
Your favorite dance song?
Because I'm Happy by Pharrell.
What food you eat every week, no matter what?
Macaroni and cheese.
And your favorite month?
September.
Rodney, it has been such a pleasure to spend time with you on Black Entrepreneur Experience. But before we let you go,
yes,
what is the best way for our audience to connect with you and support your business? But I also would like you to plug your book. Absolutely. How can they get your book? Tell them about your book.
Yes, it's called Get Off the Cycle and Run. If you enjoy the analogies that I used while we were talking today, the book is replete with those type of stories. every single story that I shared in that book comes from my real life. So I may have tweaked a name or two to protect some folks, but the incidents of it occurring happened to me, with me, around me. And it's an extended analogy on how a bicycle parallels our life. The pedals will represent our passion. The handlebars will give us control. And if any portion of that bike isn't working, we're stuck in a cycle that we don't have control over. So we need to recognize the strengths, the weaknesses, and be able to get off that cycle and run to our purpose. So it's called Get Off the Cycle and Run. You can Google my name. I'm on everything, guys. I'm everywhere. Rodney C. Burris. That's Facebook, that's Twitter, that's Instagram, that's YouTube. I got tons of videos on YouTube. If you enjoy the banter that Dr. Francis and I were having, I have little snippet videos that have more of that content. And then the last thing that I want to share is that if any of you work with young people in our society today that are interacting with law enforcement, I did a video on how to make it home. It is 5 tips, and I do it in a way. When we were younger, Dr. P, when my great-grandma, I had a great-grandma in Gastonia, North Carolina. She would put sugar on cod liver oil and make us swallow it sometimes before we went to bed if anybody was like sneezing. Nastiest stuff in the world, the honey made it a little bit better. I put honey on those 5 tips. It's a lot of humor. It's a lot of little voice editing and things like that. But those 5 tips for our young people so that for those who haven't been exposed to positive individuals like yourself, to know what to do when engaging law enforcement. This way, if they get this and it sinks in, maybe somebody's baby could come home every single day. So that video is on my YouTube. It's called Make It Home Alive. Again, Rodney C. Burris on any email, Gmail, social media is the way to get in touch. I would love to follow up with you all. I would love to hear from you. I would love to come to your groups, your organizations. I'm just grateful to be here with you, Dr. Francis. I'm going to call you Dr. B. I think I'm going to start that movement within the group.
I know. I love that.
Dr. B. Be a little logo with a little buzzy bee running around. I love it.
Rodney, you're the best. Thank you so much for your time. And you keep us posted on if you have another book that come out or anything that you want us to promote. You just let us know.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
All right. That's a wrap.
Thank you for listening and subscribing to Black Entrepreneur Experience. We would love for you to leave a review and rating on iTunes and share with your friends. For show notes and more episodes, go to www.beepodcast.com. Join us next Wednesday, and remember, green is the new black. So keep your bank accounts and your business